Hello everyone. Welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind, so before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1. The night was silent, with a soft rain gently falling. Everyone was asleep, but a story was just beginning. On a cold March night in a small town in Argentina, everything seemed completely normal. But no one knew that within that silence, a story was unfolding. One that would remain unfinished forever. A story where someone left home and never came back. A few days later, that silence was finally given a name. This is the story of Tehuel de la Torre. Born on March 26, 1999, Tehuel was stepping into a new chapter of his life. He was living in San Vicente, Argentina, with his partner and her son, while staying closely connected to his family. He had recently begun his gender transition, embracing his identity as a trans man and trying to build a future on his own terms. But on March 11, 2021, everything changed. He left home for what seemed like a simple job interview in Alejandro Corn, where he was going to meet Luis Alberto Ramos, a man who had offered him work at a food event. That day became the last time he was seen. His sister, Veronica Larcon, saw him on his way to Ramos's house, where another man, Oscar Montez, was also present. Tehuel walked inside that house and was never seen again. As the investigation unfolded, Luis Alberto Ramos was arrested, brought to trial, and convicted of trans homicide, receiving a life sentence, while Oscar Montez remains in custody, awaiting trial. Despite everything, both men have refused to reveal what truly happened to Tehuel or where he is. His disappearance has since become more than just a case. It has become a powerful call for justice as his family, friends, and the wider LGBTQ+ community continue to search for answers. After Tehuel disappeared, his family reported him missing just 2 days later. A search operation was launched, and police began investigating the last place he was seen. Soon, officers carried out a raid at Luis Alberto Ramos's house. During that search, they discovered disturbing evidence: Tehuel's phone and parts of his clothing. These findings only deepened the mystery. If Tehuel had entered that house, why had he never come out? After Tehuel was reported missing, police began tracing his last known movements. Their investigation quickly led them to the home of Luis Alberto Ramos in Alejandro Corn, the last place Tehuel had been seen. A raid was carried out at the property, where investigators discovered disturbing evidence. Among the items found were Tehuel's phone and pieces of his clothing. The condition of these items raised serious concerns. As investigators looked deeper, inconsistencies in the suspect's statements began to appear. The timeline did not match, and key details were either missing or contradictory. The more authorities uncovered, the clearer it became that this was not a simple disappearance, but something far more disturbing. After the search for Tehuel began, the Provincial Ministry of Justice and Human Rights provided support to the prosecutor's office through its Undersecretariat of Criminal Policy. One of the key steps taken was the involvement of the Provincial Agency for Children and Adolescents, which offered advisory input specifically related to trans masculinities. This was intended to ensure that the investigation remained sensitive to the unique experiences and vulnerabilities of trans men. At the same time, another line of inquiry explored the possibility of human trafficking. This angle of the case was taken seriously by several organizations, some of which continue to raise concerns about it. Protex, the specialized anti-trafficking unit, brought in the rescue and support team for victims of human trafficking to assist in the investigation, particularly during a search of a property connected to the case. However, by July 2021, no concrete evidence of trafficking or sexual exploitation had been found at that location. Following Tehuel's disappearance, the Directorate Against Gender Violence also developed multiple lines of investigation focused on violence against the trans population. This effort aimed to strengthen the capacity of provincial justice authorities to investigate and prosecute both lethal and non-lethal violence targeting trans individuals. All of these actions were carried out in accordance with protocols established by the National Public Prosecutor's Office, specifically through its Specialized Prosecutors Unit for Violence Against Women, UFVM. For provincial authorities, Taywell's case has highlighted a significant gap in addressing the specific forms of violence faced by trans men. It remains a clear reminder that there is still a substantial debt and an unfinished agenda when it comes to ensuring protection, justice, and recognition for this community. In 2024, the case reached a crucial turning point when Luis Alberto Ramos stood trial before the Oral Criminal Court No. 2 of La Plata. The panel of judges, Claudio Bernard, Sylvia Hoare, and Ramiro Fernandez Lorenzo, delivered a historic ruling. For the first time, the crime was officially recognized as a trans homicide. Ramos was found guilty of aggravated homicide, motivated by hatred toward gender identity and sexual orientation. He was also held responsible for the disappearance of Taywell's body and for the suffering caused to his loved ones. Outside the courthouse in La Plata, Taywell's mother, Norma, stood alongside Monica Galvin as the sentence was announced, a moment marked by grief, but also a sense of justice. In July 2025, the Criminal Cassation Court of the province of Buenos Aires upheld the life sentence, with judges Daniel Carroll and Ricardo Maidana confirming the ruling and reinforcing its significance. The homes of Monica Galvin and Norma Nawalkura, Taywell's mother, are only 10 blocks apart. Yet before this case, they had never met. When Monica first learned about Taywell's disappearance, she went directly to meet his family, offering support in a moment of deep uncertainty. Today, she is part of the Association of Family and Friends of Taywell, a group dedicated to keeping his case alive and demanding justice. Norma and I didn't know each other before, Monica later said in an interview. But when I heard about Taywell, I went to help. From that moment on, we began a long journey, searching, demanding answers, and raising our voices for justice. Even now, she describes the pain as ongoing. It is still a very painful reality. We miss Taywell. We don't know what happened to him, and we don't know where he is. His mother is still waiting, still wondering where her son is. The day after Taywell disappeared, his partner attempted to file a missing person report, following his mother's request. But police initially refused to take the report. It was only accepted 2 days later, on Saturday. A formal search did not begin until Monday, by which time protests had already started in Alejandro Corn and San Vicente. According to Monica, the delay between Taywell's disappearance and the official report, nearly 4 days, was critical. During that time, no state agency took immediate action. She believes those lost hours allowed the suspects to destroy key evidence. Taywell's clothes were reportedly burned, his phone was damaged, and parts of the house were altered. The property was cleared out, and objects like mattresses were moved or hidden, possibly in an attempt to erase any trace of what had happened. For Monica, the sentencing of Luis Alberto Ramos brought a certain sense of relief. The severity of the ruling sent a strong message of justice at a time when violence against sexual minorities was on the rise. It was not just a legal decision. It carried symbolic weight for an entire community demanding recognition and protection. However, the trial unfolded during a difficult political climate. Monica recalled hearing statements from Mariano Cuneo Liberona, who was serving as Minister of Justice at the time, suggesting that the concept of family was limited to a man and a woman. She also noted criticism directed at dissidents by Javier Milei, reflecting a broader surroundings of tension and division. According to her, these circumstances made the fight for justice even more challenging. Despite this, Monica emphasized that the court handling the case approached gender issues with sensitivity and care. The crime was officially classified as a trans homicide, and prosecutors sought the maximum penalty for Ramos. The life sentence was later upheld by the Court of Cassation, establishing a historic precedent. According to Monica, there are no other rulings of this kind in the Americas, making this case not only exemplary, but also a crucial step toward answering long-standing questions for their collective. She also highlighted the role of the Pride and Struggle Front, whose involvement helped push the trial forward. Originally, in 2023, the court had set the trial date for 2027. But as Monica explained, Norma could not wait 6 years to find out what happened to her son, and we already knew what the outcome of the trial should be. Taywell's disappearance intensified a long-standing demand from activists and civil society for the transgender employment quota law. Just 3 months after he went missing, the National Congress passed the legislation, marking a historic step that opened access to government jobs for many trans people across the country. For the first time, structural inclusion began to take legal shape. However, implementation of the law has remained inconsistent. Under the current government led by Javier Milei, reports have emerged of trans workers being removed from public sector positions, raising concerns among activists about regression in hard-won rights. Monica Galvin, who is part of the Association of Family and Friends of Taywell, as well as a protective mother, feminist activist, and advocate for survivors of child sexual abuse, reflects on this day as more than just a moment of grief. For her, it is also a moment of reflection. She explains that it is essential to understand what is happening to their lives under current national policies, which she believes are increasingly restrictive and discriminatory. According to her, institutions that once provided protection have been dismantled or weakened. She highlights the closure of INADI, National Institute Against Discrimination, Xenophobia and Racism, as well as the dismantling of the Ministry of Women, both of which previously supported the case and the broader struggle for justice. In her view, the removal of material and institutional support makes the future feel even more uncertain and fragile. On days like this, when Taywell's whereabouts are still unknown, the sense of loss and injustice becomes even heavier. In parallel, another trial in connection with Taywell's case remains pending. Oscar Montez, initially arrested for obstruction of justice, interference with the investigation, and perjury, was later also charged with aggravated homicide based on gender identity. Montez's legal defense has requested a jury trial, but no date has yet been set. Meanwhile, the lawyers representing Taywell's family have requested that members of the LGBTQ plus community be included in the jury, emphasizing the importance of representation in such a sensitive case. 5 years later, Taywell's image continues to appear on T-shirts, posters, and in public marches, kept alive as a symbol of memory, resistance, and the ongoing demand for justice. Taywell de la Torre's case reminds us that justice is not limited to the courtroom. It is deeply connected to human dignity, safety, and equality. A society remains incomplete until every individual, regardless of their gender identity, is protected, respected, and given the right to live without fear. Case 2 it all began with what seemed like an ordinary relationship, two people meeting through a dating app, starting something new, something hopeful. But beneath that normal beginning, something wasn't right. This is the story of Cecilia Strzezowski, a young woman with a job, a routine life, and a relationship that slowly began to change into something far more complicated and unsettling. As time went on, allegations of control, emotional pressure, and growing tension began to surface. And what followed next would turn this case into one of the most widely discussed and disturbing mysteries. The question remains, how does something that starts so normal end in something so dark? Strzezowski was born on August 3rd, 1994. She worked as an administrative employee at a health center and was also the owner of a cafeteria. Cecilia Strzezowski lived with her partner, 19-year-old Cesar Sena, in her aunt's house. According to her mother, Gloria Romero, Cecilia and Cesar met in December 2021 through the dating app Tinder. However, problems gradually began to appear in their relationship, especially due to Cesar's mother's opposition to the relationship. It was also reported that Cesar tried to control Cecilia, such as monitoring her movements through WhatsApp. In addition, Cesar was said to possess weapons and claimed that he was a victim of political persecution. On September 16, 2022, Cecilia and Cesar got married, but just 4 days later they started divorce proceedings. It was believed that Cesar's mother had a strong influence on this decision, as she did not approve of the relationship. Even after deciding to separate, the couple still handed out invitation cards for a wedding party planned on December 23rd. However, the divorce was finalized just 2 days before the event, and the celebration was eventually canceled. At that time, Cecilia's mother was not even aware that the divorce had taken place until her daughter went missing. Despite everything, Cecilia and Cesar did not completely break up. They were still seen together and continued meeting each other. Cecilia's mother later said that Cesar initially seemed like a caring and supportive partner, but she later heard from a friend that things were not as they appeared. According to that account, Cesar allegedly physically attacked Cecilia on May 3rd, 2023. There were also growing concerns about Cesar's behavior. It was said that he was on medication and had previously even assaulted his own mother. Cecilia's psychologist, who had treated her just 2 days before she disappeared, also supported concerns about gender-based violence and mentioned the possible use of psychotropic medication. Cesar Sena is the son of Emerenciano Sena and Marcela Acuña. His family is known for having a strong social and political presence, with close ties to the government of Chaco province. These connections are reflected in their involvement in public works, social services, and housing programs carried out through various organizations such as Fundación Dr. Saul Acuña, Fundación Emerenciano Sena, and Cooperativa de Trabajo Emerenciano Limitada. In 2023, these organizations reportedly received around 141 million Argentine pesos in transfers from the provincial government. The family is described as financially powerful, owning several properties that are now under investigation due to alleged financial irregularities and possible asset evasion. Among these properties are 2 land plots in Colonia Benitez, located about 10 kilometers from Resistencia, with an estimated value of around $130,000. One of these plots includes the family residence, which has also become a key focus in the investigation related to the alleged murder of Cecilia Strzeszowski. Emerenciano Sena's political and social activity began in the 1990s when he founded the movement of unemployed workers together with leader Ramon Tito Lopez. After the breakup of the MTD, he later collaborated with Sergio Schocklender and Hebe de Bonafini, the head of the Sueños Compartidos cooperative, in housing construction projects on occupied land. However, these projects later collapsed due to legal and financial issues in 2020, the national government transferred those same lands to the provincial government of Chaco, which later handed them over to Emerenciano Sena. In 2009, the Saul Andres Acuña Foundation was created to manage and carry out projects led by Emerenciano and Marcela Acuña. During the 2023 provincial elections in Chaco, Emerenciano Sena, Gustavo Obregon, Marcela Acuña, and Fabiana Gonzalez were part of the unique Socialist Party, PSU, list within the ruling Frente de Todos alliance. Emerenciano and Gustavo were set to run as deputy candidates, Marcela Acuña for mayor and Fabiana Gonzalez for city councilor in Resistencia. However, following the disappearance scandal and public backlash, their candidacies were ultimately withdrawn by the Chaco Front. On June 1st, 2023, Cecilia had a video call with her mother, Gloria Romero, in which she told her that she was going on a trip to Ushuaia with her partner, Cesar Sena, supposedly for a job opportunity. This reason was later supported by her psychologist as well. That same afternoon, Cecilia was seen leaving her aunt's house in Resistencia with Cesar Sena. She was wearing light gray sweatpants, a dark gray jacket, and gray sneakers with pink details, while Cesar was carrying a partially empty red backpack. A relative later stated that Cecilia appeared nervous, and when asked about the lack of luggage, Cesar reportedly said he would buy clothes in Buenos Aires. At that time, there was also a major temperature difference, with Resistencia averaging around 15 degrees Celsius in June, while Ushuaia was close to 2 degrees Celsius. Her mother also noted that the logical route for such a trip would have been to fly from Corrientes to Buenos Aires first. Cecilia and Cesar left together in a white Toyota Hilux pickup truck, but the exact details of their journey and what happened afterward remain unclear. But on June 5th, Cecilia's family was approached by two anonymous individuals claiming to be investigators, who suggested that something may have happened to her, based on information from a neighbor in the Emerenciano neighborhood. Around the same time, the family's attempts to contact Cecilia were unsuccessful, as they only received written replies stating that her phone was broken. When they requested a voice note, they were sent old audio recordings, which increased their concerns. Later, Cecilia's Aunt Mercedes exchanged messages with Cesar, who claimed that he was in Ushuaia with Cecilia, but added that she had gone out with another man. After this, communication was completely lost. The following day, a security camera reportedly captured Cecilia entering the Sena family home at 9:15, but there was no footage of her leaving. Around the same period, her phone signal was last detected in a rural area near Tres Horquetas, close to Resistencia. Investigators later stated that they could find no evidence that the alleged trip to Ushuaia actually took place, leading to suspicions that Cecilia may have been misled in order to facilitate the crime. Once Cecilia's disappearance was officially reported on June 6th, the prosecutor's office immediately activated the missing persons and femicide investigation protocols. Multiple specialized units were involved in the case, including criminal intelligence, homicide and capture divisions, cybercrime units, anti-human trafficking departments, as well as press and highway police units. Authorities also requested detailed data from geolocation services, telephone companies, and social media platforms such as WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook in order to trace her last movements. By June 8th, both the Provincial Security and Justice System of Chaco and the Federal Missing Person Search System had joined the operation to locate Cecilia. The Provincial Human Rights and Gender Secretariat, led by Silvana Perez, called for the investigation to be conducted with a gender-sensitive approach and informed the National Ministry of Women, Genders, and Diversity. At the same time, federal forces including the Argentine Federal Police, Airport Security Police, National Gendarmerie, and Naval Prefecture were placed on alert, with checkpoints established at roads, airports, bus terminals, and provincial as well as international borders. During this phase, Cecilia's phone was also ordered to be unlocked, and data requests were submitted to telecom and media providers for further analysis. That on June 12th, the Public Prosecutor's Office formed a dedicated investigative team to handle the case, led by prosecutors Jorge Fernando Gomez and Nelia Velasquez, marking a more focused and intensified stage of the investigation. Cesar Sena was called to testify in court on June 6th. When he arrived, journalists reportedly captured visible scratches on his neck, which immediately drew public attention. Prosecutors later suggested that the condition of his hands and injuries could be consistent with a possible strangulation attempt against the victim. After giving his statement as a witness, investigators noticed several contradictions in his testimony. This led prosecutor Jorge Casares Oliveira to order a search of the Sena family residence. During the raid, authorities reportedly found a butcher's saw, a machete, ammunition, blood-like stains, and bone fragments, all of which intensified the seriousness of the case. Shortly after, the prosecution moved to reclassify the investigation as a femicide. One of the working hypotheses suggested by investigators was that Cecilia's phone was last active in an area linked to pig farms on the Sena property. Further developments came when Magali Fernandez Leyes, a member of the Emerenciano Foundation, voluntarily provided evidence, claiming that the Sena family had changed their mobile phones on June 2nd, just one day after Cecilia disappeared. She also shared a WhatsApp audio from Marcela Acuña's sister, in which concerns were allegedly expressed that someone had witnessed disturbing events involving pigs on the property. By June 13th, the prosecutor's office officially upgraded the case from a missing persons investigation to an alleged femicide. That same day, several individuals, including Melgarejo, Fabiana Gonzalez, and Gustavo Obregon, were summoned to testify. However, only Melgarejo appeared before authorities. According to his statement, he and his partner claimed to have seen Cesar Sena and Gustavo Obregon arriving at the Sena residence with Cecilia on June 4th, where she was reportedly seen sitting in the back seat of a vehicle during lunch hours. It was later alleged that she was killed and her body disposed of in the Puerto Tirol area. A search operation was launched in that location, but no physical evidence was recovered. Meanwhile, additional raids were conducted at properties linked to Fabiana Gonzalez in Villa Itati and Gustavo Obregon in Villa Centenario, where investigators also seized clothing believed to be connected to Cecilia's visit to the Sena household. Despite extensive searches and multiple lines of inquiry, the case remained heavily dependent on testimonies and ongoing forensic analysis, keeping public attention and uncertainty at its peak. After a search operation in the Emerenciano neighborhood, investigators reportedly discovered burned remains of a suitcase with wheels, along with clothing and personal accessories that had been partially incinerated. All recovered items were sent for forensic examination at the Institute of Medicine and Forensic Sciences of the province, where they were later shown to Cecilia Struzazowski's family. On June 23rd, Gloria Romero identified the recovered belongings as items that belonged to her daughter, including jewelry, such as a pendant and ring she used to wear. Later, on July 3rd, authorities confirmed the presence of burned human remains in the patio of the Sena residence. Subsequent genetic testing further revealed that blood samples collected from a room inside the house matched Cecilia's DNA, along with additional traces found on a mattress, strengthening the forensic link to the case. During the legal proceedings, several changes occurred in the defense team representing the accused. Armando Cabra, a former official from the Chaco Ministry of Security, became part of the legal defense for Emerenciano Sena and Marcela Acuna. Earlier, their lawyer Juan Carlos Sef resigned after allegedly learning about communications suggesting possible arrangements involving a judge. After that, Ricardo Osuna initially took over the defense of the Sena family, but later stepped down from representing Emerenciano Sena and Marcela Acuna, continuing only with the defense of Cesar Sena. Present. Cesar Sena is represented by Ricardo Osuna, who stated that he would not make public declarations and that his defense would rely strictly on the case file, which he described as being based on indications and presumptions. Before Osuna, Cesar was also defended by Juan Diaz, who simultaneously represented Fabiana Gonzalez and Gustavo Obregon, but he resigned due to what he described as irreconcilable differences after new evidence was added to the case. After his resignation, Cesar was briefly represented by official public defenders Patricia Alexic and Martha Corina Paz until Osuna took over the defense. On June 9th, authorities carried out a raid at the residence of Emerenciano Sena and Marcela Acuna, where investigators reportedly found around 6 million pesos in cash with no clear justification. This discovery opened a new line of investigation related to possible money laundering and tax evasion. As a result, the federal justice declared itself not competent in the case, and it was transferred to Federal Court of First Instance No. 2 in Resistencia, led by Judge Ricardo Mayanovich, with Prosecutor Patricio Sabadini assigned to the investigation. Cesar Sena's former lawyer, Juan Diaz, who also represented the Emerenciano Socialist Movement, stated that the money originated from a public works program and was intended for the purchase of construction materials in a separate development. An incident inside the detention context added further controversy to the case. Marcelina Sena reportedly attempted to visit her brother Emerenciano Sena while he was in custody. During this visit, authorities allegedly seized 2 pills and a handwritten letter from her, in which a possible arrangement was mentioned involving Judge Rosalia Zazzoli of the Guarantees Court in Prosecutor's Office No. 3. The alleged purpose of this arrangement was to secure house arrest for Emerenciano Sena by simulating a medical condition related to blood sugar levels. The letter also referenced Cesar Sena's lawyer, Ricardo Osuna, who denied any involvement or responsibility in the matter. Following this incident, the Attorney General's office formed a special prosecutor's team to investigate the contents of the letter and the alleged judicial arrangement. On June 9th, Prosecutor Jorge Oliverio requested the arrest of Emerenciano Sena and Marcela Acuna, and an international arrest warrant was also issued for Cesar Sena, who had already gone into hiding after being summoned on June 7th. In response, Acuna stated that Cesar was in Corrientes studying medicine. However, the situation escalated further as the investigation progressed that on July 10th, at around 11 p.m., Marcela Acuna was transferred to the Family and Gender Violence Department, and on the same day, Cesar Sena was also taken into custody. The following day, July 11th, additional arrests were made. Gustavo Melgarejo, the landlord of the Sena property, was detained on suspicion of helping to dispose of Cecilia's body. He was arrested along with his partner Griselda Reynosa, whose identity remained confidential until she later testified before the prosecutor's office. On the same day, Fabiana Gonzalez and Gustavo Obregon were also arrested as alleged conspirators in the case. Earlier in the investigation, on June 13th, Fabiana Gonzalez's sister, Diana Gonzalez, had been arrested as well, but she was later released without any charges. Case 3 The Winter Air in Syracuse, New York, carried a quiet chill on the evening of January 2001. Inside a small apartment on Butternut Street, a family waited for a moment that was supposed to be ordinary, a simple gathering to watch the Super Bowl together. But behind this ordinary plan, a tragedy was already unfolding. 18-year-old Jill Lynn Udo was beginning to build her own independent life after moving out of her mother Joan Browning's home on Butternut Street and settling into a 6th-floor apartment on James Street in the near northeast neighborhood. While her childhood had been split between Colorado Springs and New York after her family relocated in 1997, and although her father was not actively present in her life, Jill remained focused on her future, working at an Aeropostale store in Shoppingtown Mall, while studying to become a paramedic with hopes of joining Rural Metro, driven by a desire to help others. And at the same time, she maintained close ties with her mother and sister Jenna, even planning a simple family evening on January 28, 2001, to watch Super Bowl 35 together at her mother's home. A normal and peaceful plan that gave no indication of the tragedy that was about to unfold, while those who knew Jill later described her as someone who trusted people easily, a trait her uncle believed may have played a role in what happened to her, though he himself could not imagine anyone in her life who would want to harm her. And as that winter evening approached, everything seemed ordinary on the surface, yet behind it a dark and irreversible event was already in motion. On January 28, 2001, Jill Lynn Udo never arrived to watch the football game as planned, and as the hours passed, her absence quickly turned into concern for her mother Joan Browning and sister Jenna, who repeatedly tried to reach her but received no response. And as the calls continued into the next day, still unanswered and unreturned, the worry deepened into fear, especially when they learned that Jill had also missed work, which was completely out of character for her, and unable to shake the growing anxiety. Joanne and Jenna made the decision to go to Jill's apartment on James Street themselves, only to be met with a silence that would change their lives forever. Because once they entered inside, they found Jill unresponsive with multiple stab wounds and a cut to her neck, and investigators later determined that the weapon used in the attack was Jill's own kitchen knife, adding an even more disturbing layer to the scene, as police were immediately called and confirmed that she had been dead for some time before her mother had arrived, while the apartment itself offered very few clear clues, leaving investigators with an unsettlingly quiet and confusing crime scene where little evidence remained to explain what had truly happened. Inside those walls, this day, the person responsible for Jill Lynn Udo's murder has never been identified or brought to justice, and although police have investigated multiple individuals over the years and conducted extensive interviews, no suspect has ever been publicly named, leaving the case officially unsolved despite decades of effort, with the investigation becoming one of the largest and most complex files handled by the Syracuse Police Department, which remains open to this day. Detective Chris DeJoseph has stated that the department has not given up and will continue working on the case until it is finally resolved, and even years later, around 2016, investigators were still actively reviewing leads, monitoring potential suspects, and following up on new information, while also announcing plans to use advanced DNA testing to develop a more accurate suspect profile in hopes of finally identifying the killer. And at the time of the early investigation, a reward of $13,000 was offered for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Yet despite all of these efforts, the case remains unsolved, leaving Jill's story as a haunting reminder of how even extensive investigations can still end in unanswered questions and a justice that is yet to be delivered. Case 4, born in Morristown, New Jersey, Bonnie Lee Backley entered the world with a complicated family background. Raised partly by her grandmother in Glen Gardner, while her mother ran an antique business, and even from an early age her life seemed to drift away from stability into constant change and uncertainty. Dropping out of high school at just 15, she left for New York City, chasing dreams of modeling and acting at the Barbizon School of Modeling, a decision that would pull her into a world far more unpredictable than she may have imagined, where she met an immigrant named Evangelos Palakis who needed a marriage to stay in the United States. And in a decision that already hinted at the unusual path her life would take, she agreed to marry him for money before quickly ending the marriage and having him deported, a pattern of fleeting and transactional relationships that would only deepen as she grew older. By 21, she had already married her first cousin, Paul Gorin, in what would become the longest of her 10 marriages, a rare stability in an otherwise turbulent life. And together they had 2 children, Glenn and Holly. But even this chapter could not hold, ending in divorce in 1982, leaving behind a life story that already carried echoes of instability, reinvention, and a quiet sense that nothing in her world ever stayed still for long. As Bonnie Lee Backley's life continued, it drifted further into a shadowed world of ambition, desire, and manipulation, where she built a controversial mail-order business sending nude photographs of women, including herself, to men, while simultaneously running Lonely Hearts advertisements in magazines in search of a male companion. But what began as connection often turned into something far more transactional, as she would later ask these men for money under the pretense of rent, travel, or urgent needs, creating a pattern that blurred the line between survival and deception. As these schemes expanded, so did her financial reach, eventually allowing her to acquire multiple properties, including several houses in Memphis, Tennessee, and even a home near Los Angeles, a stark contrast to the unstable beginnings of her life. Yet despite this growing material success, her deeper ambition pulled her toward Hollywood, where she attempted to reinvent herself as a singer and actress under the stage name Lee Bonnie, chasing fame and recognition in an industry known for breaking more dreams than it fulfills. But despite her efforts, the spotlight never truly embraced her, and her Hollywood aspirations quietly faded, leaving behind a life marked by constant reinvention, controversial choices, and an unsettling sense of a woman always reaching for something just out of her grasp. As Backley's operations expanded and her web of schemes grew more complex, so too did the attention of law enforcement, and her life began to take on a darker, more unstable rhythm where ambition and consequence constantly collided. Due to the nature of her mail-order business and related dealings, she was arrested multiple times, first in 1989 in Memphis for drug possession, where she was fined $300, a small but telling warning that did little to change her path. And years later, in 1995, she was again arrested after attempting to pass 2 bad checks tied to a Memphis record company account, leading to a $1,000 fine and a sentence of weekend work on a penal farm after she accepted a plea bargain for lesser charges. Yet even these setbacks failed to slow her down, as by 1998, she was arrested once more in Little Rock, Arkansas, this time for possessing multiple forms of identification, 5 driver's licenses, and 7 social security cards under different names, a discovery that revealed the deeper mechanics of her operations, where she allegedly used these identities to open post office boxes and continue running her Lonely Hearts scams, painting a portrait of a life increasingly defined by reinvention, evasion, and a growing sense that she was always one step ahead of consequences, but never truly free from them. As Backley's life progressed, a more obsessive pattern began to emerge, one deeply rooted in fame, attention, and an almost relentless pursuit of celebrities, with friends and relatives later describing her as celebrity-obsessed. A woman who seemed convinced that proximity to fame could transform her own identity, and tapes of her phone conversations only deepened this impression as they revealed a tone of fascination and determination, where she openly expressed that being around celebrities made her feel better than other people, hinting at a mindset where status and recognition were not just desires but emotional needs. In 1990, she began actively pursuing country singer Jerry Lee Lewis, eventually managing to meet him and even forming a friendship with his sister Linda Gale Lewis. And in 1993, she claimed that her daughter Jerry Lee was Lewis's child, a claim later disproven through DNA testing. Yet even after this controversy, she continued her life, relocating to California while leaving Jerry Lee in the care of her ex-husband Paul, but still providing financial support, a decision that reflected both detachment and responsibility intertwined in a complicated way. In California, her pursuit of fame continued as she allegedly connected with well-known figures including Dean Martin, Frankie Valli, though he denied claims of any teenage relationship, and Gary Busey, each connection adding another layer to her public narrative of ambition and controversy. And by 1991, she had turned her attention toward Christian Brando, son of legendary actor Marlon Brando, writing to him while he was in prison for manslaughter and maintaining contact until after his release in 1996, when their relationship reportedly became romantic, eventually leading to Backley becoming pregnant in 1999 and initially believing Brando was the father of her child, a belief that added yet another dramatic turn to a life already defined by shifting identities, contested truths, and an unending pursuit of connection to fame that always seemed just within reach, yet never fully stable. As Backley's relationship with Christian Brando continued in the background, another connection quietly formed that would soon become central to her final chapter. Her meeting with actor Robert Blake in 1999 at a jazz club, a chance encounter that quickly evolved into a relationship filled with tension, suspicion, and uncertainty, especially after the birth of her daughter Christian Shannon Brando. When Backley told Blake she was unsure of the child's paternity and that he might be the father, a revelation that led Blake to demand a paternity test, which ultimately confirmed that he, not Brando, was the biological father, resulting in the child being legally renamed Rose Lenore Sophia Blake, a moment that tied their lives together in a way that could not easily be undone. After paternity was established, Blake agreed to marry Backley, but only under strict conditions that revealed the fragile foundation of their trust, including a temporary custody agreement, in which Backley accepted, monitored visits with Rose, and even restrictions requiring written permission for friends and family to visit Blake's property, while also agreeing that if the marriage ended, Blake would retain custody of the child, a clause so one-sided that even Backley's attorney advised her not to sign it, calling it lopsided. Yet driven by her determination to secure the marriage, she ignored the warning and signed the agreement on October 4, 2000, and later that year, in November 2000, she and Blake were married. Despite the legal bond, they never truly lived as a traditional couple, as Backley and Rose stayed in a small guest house near Blake's Studio City, California residence, a physical closeness that still felt emotionally distant, with their relationship reportedly becoming increasingly unstable as Blake's distrust grew and he eventually hired a private investigator to look in her background, only to later discover that Backley had continued her lonely heart's business even after their marriage, a revelation that deepened the fractures between them and created an atmosphere of suspicion that lingered quietly beneath what appeared on paper to be a marriage, but in reality was already unraveling under the weight of secrecy, doubt, and unresolved pasts. Before her marriage to Robert Blake, Bonnie Lee Backley's personal life had already become defined by a whirlwind of short-lived unions and constantly shifting relationships, as she had been married 9 times in total, some of those marriages lasting only days, reflecting a life where commitment often dissolved almost as quickly as it began. And among these was her 8th husband, Glenn Wolfe, a man known for holding the record for the highest number of monogamous marriages, placing Backley once again within a pattern of unusual and unstable romantic history that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Alongside this turbulent marital record, she was also a mother of 4 children, beginning with her son Glenn and daughter Holly from her second husband Paul Gorin, marking one of the few longer and more grounded chapters of her life, followed by the birth of her daughter Jerry Lee Lewis on July 28, 1993, a child she initially claimed was fathered by singer Jerry Lee Lewis before DNA testing later disproved the claim, adding yet another layer of controversy to her already complex narrative. And finally, her youngest daughter, Rose Lenore Sophia Blake, originally named Christian Shannon Brando, born in June 2000, whose paternity was first believed to be tied to Christian Brando. Born in June 2000, whose paternity was first believed to be tied to Christian Brando, before later being confirmed as Robert Blake's child, a revelation that ultimately connected Backley to Blake in a way that would define her final years and pull her into a story far larger and darker than anything she had experienced before that on May 4th, 2001. What appeared to be an ordinary evening quickly turned into a moment that would forever change the course of this story as Robert Blake took Bonnie Lee Backley to dinner at Vitello's restaurant on Tahunga Avenue in Studio City, Los Angeles, a place that likely felt unremarkable at the time, just another stop in a relationship already weighed down by mistrust and tension. After the meal, Backley was seated in the passenger seat of Blake's black 1991 Dodge Stealth, parked on a quiet side street just around the corner from the restaurant, when she was suddenly struck and killed by a gunshot to the head, an event that unfolded so abruptly it left behind more questions than clarity. And although Blake later claimed he had returned to the restaurant to retrieve a gun he had accidentally left behind and insisted he was not present at the moment of the shooting, investigators would later determine that the weapon he mentioned was not the one used in the attack, deepening the mystery rather than resolving it, and turning what began as a night out into one of the most controversial and heavily scrutinized criminal cases in Hollywood history. In the aftermath, Backley was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles, where her story came to an end in physical form, but the questions surrounding her life and death continued to linger long after the silence settled. That on March 16, 2005, after years of intense public attention and courtroom drama, Robert Blake was found not guilty of the murder of Bonnie Lee Backley, as well as one of the 2 counts of soliciting a former stuntman to kill her. While the remaining solicitation charge was dropped after it became clear that the jury was deadlocked 11-1 in favor of acquittal, bringing an official end to a trial that had gripped Hollywood and the public alike. Throughout the proceedings, Blake's defense team, led by Gerald Schwartzbach, aggressively challenged the credibility of prosecution witnesses who claimed Blake had attempted to hire them to carry out the killing, while also introducing alternative theories suggesting that Backley may have been targeted by individuals she had previously deceived in financial scams, shifting suspicion away from Blake and into the broader chaos of her past. Legal observers later noted that while prosecutors had established a possible motive, Blake's anger and emotional conflict over his belief that Backley had manipulated him into fathering a child for financial access. They ultimately failed to present direct or conclusive evidence linking him to the act itself, with CBS News legal analyst David Hancock summarizing the case by stating that there was no single part of their case that was strong enough to overcome the many weak links, reflecting the fragmented nature of the prosecution's argument. Following the verdict, Los Angeles County District Attorney Steve Cooley publicly criticized the outcome, calling Blake a miserable human being and describing the jurors as incredibly stupid, comments that sparked further controversy as both Blake's defense team and members of the jury pushed back, insisting the prosecution had not met its burden of proof, while during the trial the defense also made its own damaging claims about Backley's character, alleging she struggled with drug addiction and even used her eldest daughter Holly in prostitution, accusations that further complicated an already deeply polarizing case, leaving the public with no clear closure, only competing narratives, unresolved questions, and a story that continued to divide opinion long. After the final verdict was delivered that on November 18, 2005, the legal aftermath of Bonnie Lee Backley's death reached another defining turning point when Robert Blake was found liable in a civil trial for her wrongful death, a verdict that came after Backley's three eldest children filed a lawsuit arguing that he was responsible for their mother's killing, shifting the focus from criminal acquittal to civil accountability and reopening public debate about a case that had already deeply divided opinion. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial, often described as a Perry Mason moment, occurred when attorney Eric Dubin called the girlfriend of Blake's longtime bodyguard and co-defendant Earl Caldwell to the stand and unexpectedly asked whether she believed they had been involved in the crime, a question she had never been directly asked before, and in the tense silence that followed, emotions overwhelmed the courtroom as she paused, visibly shaken, before leaning into the microphone and stating that yes, she did believe they were involved, a testimony that left a lasting impression on those present and became one of the most memorable exchanges of the entire case. Ultimately, the jury ordered Blake to pay $30 million in damages, a ruling that carried heavy financial and symbolic weight in the years that followed. Blake's personal and financial situation deteriorated further, and in 2006, he filed for bankruptcy, reporting debts of around $3 million including unpaid legal fees and taxes, while on April 9, 2010, the state of California issued a tax lien against him for over $1.1 million in unpaid back taxes, further cementing his financial collapse. Later, on April 26, 2008, an appeals court upheld the civil verdict but reduced the damages to $15 million. While rejecting arguments from Blake's attorneys that jurors had improperly discussed the Michael Jackson and O.J. Simpson cases during deliberations, ruling that such references did not invalidate the decision, and leaving the civil judgment largely intact, ensuring that even after the criminal trial ended, the legal and financial consequences of Backley's death continued to follow Blake for years, extending the case's legacy far beyond the courtroom and into a long, unresolved shadow over both lives. Case 5, she was the kind of person whose life looked like it was carefully moving upward, step by step, as if everything had already been planned for a successful future. Born in Cleveland, Ohio to Robert and Susan Levy, her story began in a normal family setting before they later moved to Modesto, California, where she spent her school years at Grace M. Davis High School, quietly building the foundation of her ambitions. Her family remained connected to their faith as members of Congregation Beth Shalom, a conservative Jewish synagogue, while she herself was already showing signs of curiosity about the world beyond her hometown. That curiosity eventually carried her to San Francisco State University, where she earned a degree in journalism, learning how to observe, question, and report the world around her. After graduation, she stepped into real-world experience through an internship with the California Bureau of Secondary Education and later worked in the office of Los Angeles Mayor Richard Riordan, gaining exposure to political and administrative environments that shaped her understanding of public life. Her journey didn't stop there. She continued her education at the University of Southern California, pursuing a master's degree in public administration, a move that suggested a future filled with stability and achievement. But behind this steady rise, life was quietly moving towards something far more uncertain, a turning point that would soon shift her story from ambition and progress into something far more haunting and unresolved. As part of her final semester of study, Levy moved to Washington, D.C. to become a paid intern with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And in October 2000, she began working at the Bureau's headquarters in the Public Affairs Division, where she was entrusted with handling sensitive media inquiries, including those connected to the upcoming execution of Timothy McVeigh, a case that drew intense national attention and required careful communication. Her supervisor, Bureau spokesperson Dan Dunn, was impressed with her professionalism and the way she managed pressure in high-stakes situations. But in April 2001, her internship was suddenly brought to an end after an unexpected discovery that her academic eligibility had already expired in December 2000, despite the fact that she had completed her master's degree requirements and was still only weeks away from returning to California in May 2001 for graduation. Levy was last seen on May 1st, 2001, and several days passed without any contact before concern began to grow. On May 6th, the Metropolitan Police Department was alerted after her parents in Modesto reported they had not heard from her in 5 days, prompting officers to check hospitals and visit her apartment in DuPont Circle, where no immediate signs of foul play were found. The situation began to shift on May 7th when her father informed police that she may have been involved in an affair with a U.S. congressman. And by the following day, he identified U.S. Representative Gary Condit as the individual he believed was connected. A claim later echoed when her aunt also told investigators that Levy had confided in her about the relationship. As concern deepened, police obtained a warrant on May 10th to conduct a formal search of her apartment, where they discovered her credit cards, identification, and mobile phone still inside her purse, along with partially packed suitcases, suggesting she may have been preparing for something but never completed it. Her answering machine was full of messages from relatives as well as two from Condit. While during the early stages of the investigation, a police sergeant attempting to examine her laptop accidentally corrupted internet search data, an error that later complicated efforts to reconstruct her final online activity. Computer experts spent about a month reconstructing the corrupted data from Levy's laptop, eventually determining that it had been used on the morning of May 1st to search for a range of topics, including Amtrak, Baskin-Robbins, Gary Condit, Southwest Airlines, and a weather report from the Washington Post, with her final recorded search at 12:59 p.m. being for Alsace-Lorraine in France. Earlier activity showed that at 11:33 a.m., she searched for information on Rock Creek Park via the Washington Post Entertainment Guide, and just a minute later at 11:34 a.m., she clicked a link to view a map of the park, a detail that later led investigators to consider whether she may have arranged to meet someone there, possibly near the Pierce Klingel mansion that serves as the park headquarters. In the weeks that followed, search efforts were expanded, including a large-scale sweep on July 25th, 2001 along Glover Road in Rock Creek Park involving police sergeants and cadets, but no evidence connected to Levy was discovered. Even after a second search also produced no results. As the investigation continued without answers, her parents and friends organized numerous vigils and press conferences, repeatedly appealing to the public in hopes of bringing Chandra home, keeping attention on the case as uncertainty and concern continued to grow. Controversy surrounding Levy's disappearance quickly drew widespread attention from the American news media, especially as questions began to focus on U.S. Representative Gary Condit, who at first denied having any affair with her, while police officially stated that he was not a suspect. However, Levy's family expressed concerns that he was being evasive and withholding information. Later, unidentified police sources claimed that Condit had admitted to an affair. During a July 7th, 2001 interview with law enforcement, in which he also described Levy and mentioned details about her lifestyle and future plans, including his belief that she would return to Washington, D.C. after graduation, and his surprise regarding her apartment lease ending. As the investigation deepened, authorities searched Condit's apartment on July 10th and also questioned flight attendant Anne-Marie Smith, who alleged that Condit had discouraged her from speaking to the FBI about his personal life, leading federal officials to examine possible obstruction of justice due to his connections with both women. Amid growing media pressure and leaked information, Condit refused to take a D.C. police polygraph test, though his attorney later claimed he had passed a privately administered one. And in a televised interview on August 23rd with Connie Chung on ABC's Primetime Thursday, he avoided direct answers to key questions, fueling further public scrutiny, until eventually the case's intense media coverage was largely overshadowed by the events of September 11th, 2001, in a nationwide Fox News/opinion. Dynamics poll of 900 registered voters conducted in July 2001, 44% of American respondents believe that Gary Condit may have been involved in Levy's disappearance, while 27% felt he should step down from his position. At the same time, 51% of those surveyed said he appeared to be behaving in a way that suggested guilt, and only 13% supported the idea of him running for office again. Interestingly, voters within Condit's own congressional district showed a more favorable opinion of him compared to the national sample. Moving forward, political pressure continued to build, and on March 5th, 2002, Condit was defeated in the Democratic primary election for his congressional seat by his former aide, then Assemblyman Dennis Cardoza, with the Levy case being widely viewed as one of the key factors influencing the outcome. Later, he was subpoenaed to appear before a District of Columbia grand jury on April 1st, 2002, as part of the ongoing investigation into Levy's disappearance, with the date kept tightly confidential to prevent media leaks, and ultimately, Condit left Congress at the end of his term on January 3rd, 2003, after failing to secure re-election. On May 22nd, 2002, at around 9:30 a.m., skeletal remains that were later confirmed through dental records to be those of Levy were discovered in Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., after a man walking his dog, while also looking for turtles, came across them near Broad Branch Creek. When detectives arrived, they found bones and personal items scattered rather than buried in a forested area along a steep incline, including a sports bra, sweatshirt, leggings, and tennis shoes among the recovered evidence. Although earlier searches had covered more than half of the park's main 1,754-acre area, the specific wooded slope where the remains were found had been missed due to a search error, as officers were instructed to search within 100 yards of every road and trail, but only searched within 100 yards of roads, leaving certain areas unchecked. The location itself was about 4 miles from Levy's apartment. After a preliminary autopsy, authorities announced that there was enough evidence to open a homicide investigation, and on May 28th, D.C. medical examiner Jonathan L. Arden officially ruled the death a homicide, while also noting the limited condition of the remains and stating that the exact cause of death might never be determined. Although damage to the hyoid bone suggested possible strangulation, it was not considered conclusive evidence. Later, on June 6th, private investigators hired by Levy's family located her shin bone along with twisted wire about 25 yards from the original site, and police officials, including Chief Charles H. Ramsey, acknowledged the oversight, calling it unacceptable that these items had not been discovered. During the earlier official searches, on May 28, 2002, the Levy family held a memorial service at the Modesto Center Plaza, which was attended by more than 1,200 people, including some who traveled from as far as Los Angeles to pay their respects. During the 90-minute ceremony, several speakers addressed the gathering, including Levy's brother, grandmother, great-aunt, and close friends who shared memories of her life. Rabbi Paul Gordon delivered a eulogy in both Hebrew and English, describing Levy as a good person taken from us much too soon, reflecting the grief felt by those who knew her. Nearly a year later, on May 27, 2003, her remains were laid to rest in Lakewood Memorial Park Cemetery in Houston, California, near her hometown of Modesto, in a private burial ceremony attended by about 40 family members and friends, which concluded with a symbolic release of 12 white doves. In September 2001, Washington, D.C. police and federal prosecutors were approached by the lawyer of an informant who was being held in D.C. jail, with the informant claiming to have information about Levy's killer. According to the account, he alleged that Ingmar Guandique, a 20-year-old undocumented immigrant from El Salvador, who was also incarcerated at the same facility, had said that Gary Condit paid him $25,000 to kill Levy. However, investigators quickly dismissed the claim linking Condit to the crime, as Guandique had already admitted to attacking 2 other women in Rock Creek Park, the same area where Levy's remains were later found, and records also show that he failed to report to work on the day of her disappearance, with his former landlady recalling that he appeared visibly scratched and bruised around that time. Despite these connections, investigators did not formally interview other victims from Rock Creek Park in relation to the case, and law enforcement leadership was cautious in their language. Police Chief Charles H. Ramsey avoided labeling Guandique as a suspect, instead referring to him as a person of interest and urging the public not to overemphasize his role, while Assistant Chief Terrence W. Gaynor later stated that if Guandique had been a confirmed suspect, police would have pursued him aggressively, like flies on honey. Guandique denied any involvement in Levy's attack, but the investigation continued to explore the credibility of the claims surrounding him. On November 28th, the FBI administered a polygraph test to the jailhouse informant, which he failed, raising further doubts about his reliability, while Guandique himself underwent a polygraph examination on February 4th, 2002 that produced inconclusive results and was officially recorded as not deceptive. Authorities later noted complications in the testing process, explaining that neither the informant nor Guandique was fluent in English, and D.C. Chief Detective Jack Barrett stated that bilingual examiners would have been preferable, although none were available at the time. As legal proceedings moved forward, Judge Noel Anktel Kramer dismissed attempts to link Guandique directly to the Levy homicide, describing it as a satellite issue unrelated to the case at hand, and proceeded to sentence him to 10 years in prison for the separate attacks on 2 women in Rock Creek Park. Following his conviction, Guandique was first sent to the U.S. Penitentiary, Big Sandy in Kentucky, and later transferred to the U.S. Penitentiary in Victorville, California, as the broader investigation into Levy's death remained unresolved. The Levy homicide remained classified as a cold case until 2006, when Kathy L. Lanier took over as D.C. Police Chief after Charles H. Ramsey, and under her leadership the investigation was reorganized with the lead detective replaced by 3 veteran homicide investigators who brought more experience to the case. In 2007, the Washington Post assigned a new team of reporters to re-examine the case in depth, spending a year reviewing evidence and investigative gaps. And their series published in the summer of 2008 highlighted concerns about earlier failures to fully explore Guandique's potential connection to the Rock Creek Park attacks. As renewed attention built, investigators continued their efforts, and in September 2008, they searched Guandique's federal prison cell in California, where they discovered a photograph of Levy that he had kept from a magazine, while also conducting interviews with his acquaintances and witnesses linked to the other Rock Creek Park incidents in an attempt to reconstruct events and strengthen the case timeline. That on March 3, 2009, the Superior Court of the District of Columbia issued an arrest warrant for Ingmar Guandique, marking a major shift as the case moved from investigation into formal prosecution, and he was returned to the custody of the District of Columbia Department of Corrections on April 20th. Just 2 days later, Guandique was officially charged in Washington, D.C. with the murder of Levy, and a grand jury subsequently indicted him on 6 serious counts, including kidnapping, first-degree murder committed during a kidnapping, attempted first-degree sexual abuse, first-degree murder during a sexual offense, attempted robbery, and first-degree murder during a robbery. At his arraignment, he pleaded not guilty, and a trial date was initially scheduled for January 27, 2010, while his legal team unsuccessfully challenged the case by arguing that a search of his federal prison cell exceeded court jurisdiction. However, complications in evidence handling arose when certain materials were reportedly contaminated with DNA from prosecution staff during processing, which contributed to delays in the proceedings, ultimately pushing the start of the trial at the H. Carl Moultrie Courthouse to October 4, 2010, as the case moved forward under intense legal and public scrutiny. That on October 18, 2010, jury selection began at the Superior Court of the District of Columbia before Judge Gerald I. Fisher, officially opening the trial proceedings against Guandique. As Assistant U.S. Attorney Fernando Campoamor Sanchez outlined the government's witness list, which included FBI agent Brad Garrett along with the 2 women previously convicted of being assaulted by Guandique. At the outset, prosecutors estimated their case would take around 4 weeks to present, while the defense indicated it would need only about 1 day to respond. As testimony began on October 25th and 26th, Hallie Schilling and Christy Wiegand took the stand and described in detail separate attacks that occurred while they were jogging independently in Rock Creek Park, with Wiegand recounting a particularly violent assault in which Guandique allegedly grabbed her from behind, dragged her down a ravine, and pressed a knife against her face, adding a chilling dimension to the pattern of attacks presented in court. On October 26, 2010, Levy's father, Robert Levy, then 64, testified in court and addressed earlier statements he had made during the investigation about Gary Condit, explaining that in the early stages he had told authorities his daughter would have been too cautious to jog alone in wooded areas, and had also mentioned a supposed 5-year plan for marriage between Chunder and Condit. But in hindsight, he admitted that those claims were made in an emotional state and said, "I just said whatever came to mind, just to point to him as the villain," adding that he had once believed Condit was guilty until the focus of the case shifted toward Ingmar Guandique. Later, on November 1st, Condit himself testified during the trial and was repeatedly asked whether he had been in a sexual relationship with Levy. But he refused to answer, stating that he would not respond out of privacy for both himself and Chandra. During the proceedings, FBI biologist Alan Giusti also provided testimony, stating that semen found on underwear recovered from Levy's apartment contained sperm matching Condit's DNA profile, further adding complexity to the courtroom evidence presented in the case. Prosecution witness Armando Morales, who had shared a cell with Guandique at the U.S. Penitentiary in Kentucky, testified that Guandique expressed fear in 2006 about being moved between prisons due to the risk of violence against inmates accused of sexual crimes, and claimed that Guandique, a fellow Mara Salvatrucha gang member, admitted to him that he had killed Levy during an attempted robbery, while insisting that he did not rape her. After this testimony, the prosecution rested its case on November 10th, although it dropped 2 of the original 6 charges, sexual assault and murder connected to that allegation, before moving forward. On November 15th, the defense rested without calling Guandique to testify and presented other prison witnesses who challenged Morales' account. Among them, Jose Manuel Alanes stated that Guandique never mentioned rape or murder while they were housed together, though under cross-examination Alanes acknowledged that he was often asleep in prison while recovering from a gunshot wound and had not been closely attentive. As the trial progressed, the prosecution also dropped additional charges, including kidnapping and attempted robbery, due to statute of limitations issues, leaving only 2 counts of first-degree murder committed during kidnapping and robbery. In closing arguments, Prosecutor Amanda Haynes argued that Guandique had bound and gagged Levy after attacking her, leaving her in the park to die from dehydration or exposure. While defense attorney Sandra Zonenberg countered that there was no DNA evidence linking Guandique to the crime scene, describing the prosecution's case as fiction and suggesting instead that Levy was killed elsewhere and her body later placed in Rock Creek Park. The jury began deliberations on November 17, 2010, as the case entered its final phase, though proceedings experienced some delays due to heightened security measures at the courthouse. After 2 days of discussion, all but 1 juror had already moved toward a decision to convict Guandique, indicating a strong consensus forming early in deliberations. On the 3rd day, the jury sought clarification from Judge Gerald Fisher regarding the legal definition of assault, and he instructed that any physical injury, regardless of severity, could qualify as assault under the law. On November 22, 2010, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on both remaining counts of first-degree murder, bringing the trial to a close. Following the verdict, 1 juror later stated that the testimony of Armando Morales played a key role in influencing the decision, while the conviction was described by some observers as a miracle given that it was based largely on circumstantial evidence. However, the outcome remained controversial. Gladys Weatherspoon, a former attorney for Guandique in earlier assault cases, expressed concern over the verdict and suggested that jurors may have been influenced by sympathy for Levy's family during the trial. In a post-trial press conference, Susan Levy said that while the verdict brought a sense of conclusion to the legal process, it did not bring emotional closure, stating, "There's always going to be a feeling of sadness. I can surely tell you, it ain't closure." Since the trial, she has also worked to keep photographic evidence of her daughters remain sealed from public release, maintaining privacy around the most sensitive aspects of the case. On February 1st, 2011, Guandique's defense team formally requested a new trial, arguing in a 17-page filing that the original verdict had been improperly reached. The motion claimed that prosecutors had appealed to the jury's emotions during the trial and had referred to facts not in evidence, which the defense argued may have influenced the outcome. It also raised concerns about jury conduct, alleging that 1 juror who did not take notes may have been improperly influenced by another juror's notes, potentially violating the judge's instructions to avoid outside influence within deliberations. In response, the prosecution opposed the request for a retrial, maintaining that the issue raised regarding juror notes was a minor procedural matter and did not have any meaningful impact on the final verdict, and therefore did not justify overturning the conviction. Guan faced a sentencing range of a minimum of 30 years to a maximum of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and prosecutors pushed for the harshest penalty, arguing that he was unable to control himself and would continue to pose a danger to women. In a February 2011 memo, the prosecution also referenced his behavior in prison, including allegations of harassment toward female staff, such as inappropriate conduct toward a nurse and exposing himself in front of guards. Assistant U.S. Attorney Fernando Campoamor Sanchez further revealed that he had traveled to El Salvador with a detective to investigate claims that Guan had previously fled the country amid suspicions of earlier attacks against women dating back to 1999, that during the sentencing hearing on February 11th, Guan addressed Levy's family directly, saying, "I am sorry for what happened to your daughter," while continuing to maintain his innocence. And at one point, Susan Levy confronted him, emotionally, asking him to look her in the eye and confirm whether he had taken her daughter's life. After denying Guan motion for a retrial, Judge Gerald Fisher sentenced him to 60 years in prison, describing him as a continuing danger and referring to him as a sexual predator, a conclusion Guan again rejected as he repeated his claims of innocence during sentencing and has continued to maintain them in the years following the trial on February 25, 2011. Public Defender James Klein formally filed an appeal against Guan conviction with the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, initiating a new phase of legal review following the trial. The case later drew renewed attention when a series of previously undisclosed hearings took place in December 2012 and January 2013, which only became public knowledge afterward, though the specific subject matter of those meetings remained sealed by court order. After a third hearing in February 2013, the presiding judge ordered the release of transcript from the earlier proceedings, revealing that Klein was pursuing a request for a new trial based on newly presented evidence in the case. Following these developments, a fourth hearing was scheduled for April 2013 as the appeal process continued under judicial review. In May 2015, prosecutors withdrew their opposition to a new trial, a significant shift in the case that stemmed from defense claims that the prosecution's key witness, Armando Morales, had given false testimony during the original trial. The defense argued that prosecutors had failed to disclose Morales' background as a jailhouse informant with a reputation for unreliability, and further contended that he had denied acting as an informant while allegedly fabricating Guan confession in an effort to gain favor with authorities. Shortly afterward, on June 3rd, the defense introduced additional information from a new witness, a neighbor who called 911 at 4:37 a.m. on the final day Levy was seen alive, reporting a blood-curdling scream that may have come from her apartment, adding another layer of uncertainty to the timeline of events. The following day, Judge Gerald Fisher approved the motion for a new trial, and Judge Robert Morin later scheduled the retrial for March 1st, 2016, though it was subsequently rescheduled to October 11th. As the case continued to develop, November 2015 brought further complications when prosecutors informed a D.C. Superior Court judge that certain documents had not been disclosed to the defense prior to the original trial. And in December 2015, defense attorneys filed motions arguing that these procedural failures were severe enough to justify dismissal of the charges entirely. Specifically, the defense argued that they had only been provided with 2 pages of a 3-page memo detailing prosecutors' interactions with Armando Morales, with the missing first page reportedly showing that Morales had previously contacted law enforcement about gang activity, including activity involving gangs he himself had been affiliated with. At trial, Morales had testified that he had never cooperated with law enforcement before the Levy case, and the defense claimed that the withheld information could have seriously undermined his credibility by suggesting he had a history of seeking favor with authorities. They further argued that this omission was intentional and prevented the jury from fully understanding the reliability of his testimony. On July 28, 2016, prosecutors announced that they would not move forward with the retrial of Guan and instead would pursue his deportation, marking a major turning point in the long-running case. According to the Washington Post, The decision came after prosecutors lost confidence in the case when they learned that Morales had been secretly recorded admitting that he lied during his testimony at the 2010 trial. The recording, made by Babs Proler and later handed over to police, seriously damaged the credibility of the prosecution's key witness. The U.S. Attorney's Office later stated only that new information emerging in the previous week had left insufficient evidence to proceed. Ultimately, in March 2017, Guandique lost his legal efforts to remain in the United States and was deported to El Salvador 2 months later, bringing his involvement in the U.S. legal system to an end. Defense lawyers for Guandique later alleged that prosecutors Fernando Campoamor Sanchez and Amanda Haynes had intentionally withheld the first page of the Morales memo, and they filed a formal complaint with the U.S. Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility, OPR. After a 2-year investigation, however, OPR concluded that there was no evidence of ethical or legal misconduct by the prosecutors. Following the case, both prosecutors moved on professionally, with Campoamor Sanchez leaving the Justice Department to join the Securities and Exchange Commission, while Haynes later retired from federal service. Years later, in 2020, the District of Columbia Bar's Office of Disciplinary Counsel reopened scrutiny of the allegations and announced an investigation, eventually bringing formal charges in May of the following year. During proceedings, both attorneys testified about their handling of evidence and trial strategy. Haynes stated that she believed the complete memo had been provided to the defense and suggested that the missing page may have been misplaced rather than withheld intentionally. She also explained that in some cases she delayed releasing detailed witness information due to concerns that witnesses could be endangered, citing past trials where individuals have been harmed after disclosure. Both Haynes and Campoamor Sanchez also described internal disagreements during the original prosecution, noting that at the time, there were no clear Justice Department guidelines governing evidence disclosure, which led to tensions between them over trial responsibilities, including who would question key witness Armando Morales and deliver closing arguments. According to their testimony, Campoamor Sanchez was initially assigned both roles, but later had those responsibilities reassigned to Haynes, which contributed to professional conflict during the case. 3 months later, the Office of Disciplinary Counsel, ODC, issued a preliminary finding that both prosecutors had violated professional rules requiring timely disclosure of potentially exculpatory evidence to the defense, and it recommended that each be suspended from practicing law for 6 months. Both attorneys strongly challenged the proposed sanction, arguing against the conclusion and its severity, with Haynes's legal representative describing the recommendation as unhinged from both reality and from any precedent in law or logic. Despite the findings, both Haynes and Campoamor Sanchez maintained their position that they had committed no wrongdoing and continued to deny the allegations against them. The disappearance of Chandra Levy became a major national news story in the summer of 2001, with reports indicating that about 63% of Americans were closely following the case as media attention intensified around her disappearance and the investigation that followed. From a moment Levy's parents traveled to Washington, D.C. in search of their daughter, they were surrounded by intense media coverage, with reporters closely tracking every development in the case. Gary Condit later stated that at one point nearly 100 reporters were gathered outside his apartment, but that they left abruptly on the morning of September 11th, 2001, as news broke of the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, shifting national attention overnight. In the years that followed, media critics and television executives reflected on the Levy case, along with other highly sensational stories of time, as examples of the style of news coverage in the United States before September 11th reshaped media priorities. In 2002, the Washington, D.C. publication Roll Call first reported a possible connection between Ingmar Guandique and the case, although this development initially had limited impact on the media's continued focus on Gary Condit. Conservative commentator Michelle Malkin later criticized what she described as a lack of media attention to Guandique's immigration status, arguing that his background as an undocumented immigrant was underreported in coverage of the case. She referenced her review of multiple news items and noted that, in her view, very few sources highlighted this aspect, which she called a glaring omission in reporting. She also pointed out that some outlets had reported on his immigration status and legal situation, including references to his application for temporary protected status, which was ultimately denied, after which he was later linked to attacks on women in Rock Creek Park. In 2005, investigative journalist Dominic Dunn appeared on Larry King Live, where he stated his belief that Gary Condit had more information about the Levy case than he had publicly disclosed, a claim that led Condit to file 2 lawsuits against him. One of these resulted in an undisclosed financial settlement, while the other continued for several years before being dismissed in 2008 by U.S. District Judge Peter Leisure, who ruled that Dunn's comments were made in the context of media speculation and did not constitute slander, noting that they reflected discussion about inaccurate press coverage rather than factual assertions. In the summer of 2008, The Washington Post published a 13-part investigative series examining the media's handling of the case, framing it in part as an example of tabloid-style and mainstream press-packed journalism that may have affected the direction of the investigation. The reporting team behind the series, Scott Hyam and Sari Horowitz, later expanded their work into a book titled Finding Chandra, published in May 2010, which provided a deeper account of the investigation and media environment surrounding the case. Commentary on the coverage also raised broader criticism of media priorities, with some journalists, including Washington Post reporter Robert Pierre, arguing that the intense focus on Levy's disappearance reflected a disparity in coverage, noting that while hundreds of homicides occur in Washington, D.C. each year, many involving black male victims, the disproportionate attention given to Levy's case raised concerns about bias in news reporting. The media later faced criticism for what many described as a rush to judgment during the early stages of the investigation, particularly for implying, sometimes directly, that Gary Condit was responsible for Levy's murder before any evidence had been established. Some reporters stationed outside Condit's Washington apartment were even quoted as saying they intended to remain there until he resigns, reflecting the intense pressure and media fixation surrounding him at the time. When Ingmar Guandique was convicted of Levy's murder in November 2010, Condit's attorney Burt Fields commented that the outcome amounted to complete vindication, while also noting that it came too late to repair the damage, adding, "Who gives him his career back?" Years later, on the 17th anniversary of the homicide, Levy's mother continued to call for further investigation into her daughter's death, maintaining her belief that unanswered questions remained. The case also continued to be revisited in popular media and commentary, including a May 25, 2020 episode of the podcast You're Wrong About, which re-examined the disappearance and the extensive search and investigation that followed. Levy's death has had a lasting impact, shaped in part by the sustained efforts of her family and friends, and by the broader context of other high-profile, missing persons cases that help highlight gaps in resources for locating missing young adults. Shortly after her disappearance, her parents reached out for assistance from the Carol Sund/Carrington Memorial Reward Foundation, a nonprofit organization based in Modesto that had been formed after the 1999 disappearance and murder of 3 female tourists during a trip to Yosemite National Park. The foundation provided the Levies with organizational support during the search and also contributed funds toward a reward for information related to Chandra's case. In 2009, this foundation was later merged into the Lacey and Connor Search and Rescue Fund, reflecting continued collaboration among advocacy efforts connected to missing persons cases, and Susan Levy herself had previously taken part in efforts to locate Lacey Peterson, another high-profile missing woman from Modesto, whose case drew national attention in 1997. When Kristen Modafferi disappeared from the San Francisco Bay Area just 3 weeks after her 18th birthday, her parents sought help from their congresswoman because they were unable to access assistance from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. In this case, contributed to legislative change. As a result, Congress passed Kristen's Law in October 2000, which created the National Center for Missing Adults, NCMA, within the U.S. Department of Justice to help coordinate missing persons cases more effectively. By the time Levy disappeared, These systems were already in place to support families and assist nationwide investigations, and the Levy family quickly attempted to use all available resources, including offering a cash reward, hiring private investigators, and seeking extensive media coverage. However, much of these efforts were overshadowed by intense public speculation surrounding her alleged relationship with Gary Condit, which shifted attention away from investigative leads. Later, Susan Levy expanded her advocacy work by joining Donna Rayleigh, the mother of another young woman who disappeared from Modesto in 1999, to establish Wings of Protection, a support group created for families of missing loved ones. In recognition of her efforts and activism through this organization, Susan Levy was awarded the Criterion Award by the Mary and Liebert Publishing Company, known for producing the Journal of Women's Health and Gender-Based Medicine. In May 2002, Newsweek magazine later suggested that the media coverage surrounding the Levy case may have influenced reporting habits more broadly, leading journalists to become more cautious of herd mentality and more willing to consider alternative suspects, rather than focusing on a single narrative. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. police stated that Levy's body could likely have been discovered earlier, if not for a miscommunication about the scope of the search in Rock Creek Park. Commanders had instructed officers to search within 100 yards of every road and trail, but in practice searches were only conducted within 100 yards of roads, leaving portions of the wooded area unchecked and allowing the remains to remain undiscovered for a longer period. In the aftermath of the investigation, both Chief of Detectives Jack Barrett and Police Chief Charles H. Ramsey left their positions in Washington, D.C., with Ramsey later becoming head of the Philadelphia Police Department and Barrett moving into intelligence analysis work in Virginia. Barrett later reflected that the investigation had taken place under enormous amounts of pressure from the media. Armando Morales, one of the key witnesses in the case, was serving a prison sentence for drug-related conspiracy charges and was scheduled for release in 2016. Gary Condit, meanwhile, retired from politics, relocated to Phoenix, Arizona with his wife, and entered the business sector, where he managed real estate and opened 2 Baskin-Robbins franchises, both of which eventually closed. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more.